In the heart of a relentless winter storm, Elias Wilder faces a bitter struggle against the biting cold. The mountain winds howl outside his modest cabin, but inside a fiery ember barrel becomes his last hope for survival. What began as a desperate idea is about to evolve into a life-saving innovation that will change the way men endure the wild. The winds of the Rocky Mountains had a way of making the bravest men tremble. By the time Elias Wilder noticed the change in the air, it was already too late. He could feel it in his bones. The storm was coming. Thick clouds churned above the snow-covered peaks, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that even the seasoned mountain man couldn't ignore it. He sat by the hearth, watching as his fire sputtered and died, the weak flame doing little to fend off the cold creeping in from every corner of his cabin. Outside, the first gusts of wind hit, rattling the small structure. Elias pulled his furs tighter around him, but even the warmth from the thick pelts felt fleeting against the relentless chill. The fire that had kept him warm for months now seemed inadequate, its heat unable to reach the farthest corners of the cabin, where the cold settled in like an unwelcome guest. He had grown used to the wild's fury, but tonight felt different. He could hear the storm growing stronger, the wind howling louder as if it wanted to swallow him whole. He glanced over at the ember barrel he had fashioned the previous winter. It was a crude thing, designed more out of necessity than creativity, but Elias had managed to make it work, at least for a while. Yet, with the storm now threatening to turn the cabin into an icebox, he realized that the small, meager warmth it provided was no longer enough. He needed something better, something that could keep him alive through the worst of the night. Elias had spent many seasons in the Rockies, his survival skills honed by years of trapping and hunting, but the cold was a different kind of enemy, relentless, unforgiving, and tireless. The usual tricks and tools of the mountain men, hardy fires and thick furs, were losing their edge. As the wind howled outside, Elias sat in the dim light of his fire, the only sound in the cabin, the crackling of burning logs. He knew that the worst was still to come. With a deep breath, Elias rose from his seat and approached the barrel, running his hands over the rough metal. His mind raced with ideas. How could he make this work? How could he turn a simple metal barrel into something that could withstand the fury of this storm? The ember barrel was an idea born of desperation, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was his best shot at surviving the coming night. The storm wasn't just a weather front, it was a test, one that Elias couldn't afford to fail. As the storm gained momentum, Elias worked furiously, adding more logs to the fire, trying to force the cabin to stay warm. But even as the flames danced higher, the warmth they offered seemed to be swallowed up by the sheer size of the cold. The fire burned brightly, but Elias could feel the frost at the edges of the room creeping in, mocking his efforts. He sat on the rough-hewn bench near the hearth, his breath still visible in the air despite the roaring fire. His mind wandered back to the old ways, the methods passed down by other mountain men. The tried-and-true techniques of heating their cabins had worked for generations. But those methods, as reliable as they were, had their limits. Elias had reached those limits. Most men in the area would have considered the storm a mere inconvenience. They would light another fire, bundle up in their furs and wait for it to pass. But Elias knew the dangers of this kind of storm. The Rockies were unforgiving, and when the cold settled in, it could last for days, sometimes even weeks. A man's fire might burn low before the morning sun appeared, leaving him vulnerable to the elements. And in the wild, vulnerability was a luxury no one could afford. Elias looked at the ember barrel again. He had made it with the intent of making a small, manageable heat source to augment the fire, but now it seemed woefully inadequate. He had built it out of scrap metal, with only basic knowledge of heating principles. But now he realized something. The barrel could be more than just an afterthought. It could be the key to surviving this storm and every other one that came after it. He thought back to the days when he had first arrived in the Rockies. Back then, he had relied on what he had learned from the other men: how to hunt, how to trap, how to build a fire that would keep him alive. But survival wasn't just about following the rules. It was about adapting. It was about pushing beyond what had always worked and finding something that would work better. This winter, Elias was forced to confront the fact that the old ways had their limits. The fire alone wouldn't keep him warm. The furs alone wouldn't keep the cold out. If he wanted to survive this storm, he needed to innovate. The Ember barrel, crude as it was, offered him a chance to turn an old idea into something more. It was a symbol of his need to adapt, to survive. And as the winds howled louder outside, Elias knew he had no choice but to figure out how to make it work. There was no going back now. Elias stared at the Ember barrel in front of him, its glowing red coals casting flickering shadows across the cabin's wooden walls. The fire from the hearth, once the heart of warmth in this small shelter, now felt like a fading memory, barely enough to keep the cold at bay. He thought back to the many winters he had spent in the Rockies, how he had always relied on the same methods, the same tools. But now, as the storm raged outside, it was clear that those methods were no longer enough. He needed something more, something that could hold the heat longer, something that could stand against the relentless mountain cold. The idea had been stirring in his mind for hours, creeping in like the storm itself. He had heard of the Ember barrel before, a crude invention used by miners to heat their camps in the highlands. They had built simple metal barrels, kept them stocked with hot coals, and let the embers radiate warmth for hours. At first, Elias had dismissed the idea. It was a miner's tool, nothing special. But now, sitting in his cabin with the wind howling outside and the temperature dropping, he realized that it might be exactly what he needed. What if he could adapt it? What if he could turn it into something that would heat his cabin from the inside, that would keep him warm through the night and beyond? He stood up, his boots crunching softly against the floor, and walked over to the barrel. He ran his hand across the rough metal, feeling its weight and the cool surface. It was sturdy, a relic from an old mine he had found abandoned the previous season. The miners had used it to carry supplies, but now it could serve a new purpose. Elias had never been a man of advanced engineering, but he had learned enough in his years as a trapper to understand basic mechanics, enough to see how this simple device could be transformed into something that could heat the whole cabin. His first instinct was to line the inside with a thick layer of coal, perhaps more than the miners ever used. The warmth would build up, slowly radiating out. But there was a problem. Heat escaped through the cracks. He needed a way to contain it, to direct it. What he needed was a system of vents, small openings that would allow the heat to circulate but not escape. It wouldn't be easy. He didn't have the proper tools or materials, but he had his wits and the stubbornness that had kept him alive for years in the wild. Elias grabbed his iron poker from the hearth and began hammering at the barrel, shaping the metal into something more useful. It was slow work. He didn't have the luxury of time, with the storm steadily growing worse. His hands were raw from the constant pounding, but he didn't stop. There was no other choice. He had no firewood left to spare. The snow outside was too thick to venture far, and if the storm didn't let up soon, he would have to make do with what little he had. Hours passed, and by the time Elias stepped back to survey his progress, the barrel was beginning to take shape. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was something. The heat, he hoped, would now be more evenly distributed. He tested it, adding fresh embers, and watched as the warmth spread. It wasn't much yet, but he could feel the difference. His heart lifted just a little. This might work. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow as he stood in front of the makeshift Ember barrel. The wind howled fiercely outside, clawing at the walls of the cabin, but inside, the warmth from the barrel was a small, hopeful comfort. Still, Elias knew it wasn't enough. The barrel, crude as it was, could only do so much with the limited materials he had at hand. If it was going to work, truly work, he needed to refine it. He needed more than what he had. The storm raged against the cabin, the snow piling up outside, making it nearly impossible to venture into the wilderness. Elias knew that if he was to find what he needed to perfect the barrel, he would have to risk it. The nearest town was a 2-day ride on horseback, and the last thing he wanted was to be caught outside in the middle of a storm that had no intention of letting up. But this wasn't just about surviving the night. It was about making sure he could survive the next storm and the next one after that. He couldn't wait. He had to act now. There were a few things he could scrounge from his cabin, but most of what he needed wasn't readily available. He had a few metal scraps he'd gathered in past years, leftover nails, bits of iron from old tools, and even some worn-out hinges. But none of it was enough to create a truly solid construction. He needed more. He needed iron brackets, heavier metal, and the kind of sturdy components that would stand up to the punishment the barrel would take from the heat. Without hesitation, Elias grabbed his thick fur coat, slung it over his shoulders, and adjusted his boots. He had only a limited amount of time before the storm would turn from dangerous to deadly. He needed to make a quick run to the nearby woodshed to grab the last of the wood and to see if he could scrounge any additional materials that might be useful. There was a small supply of nails hidden beneath a tarp in the shed, along with some old iron hinges. They wouldn't be much, but they could work in the barrel's construction. With his pack on his back and his rifle at his side, Elias ventured out into the blizzard. The snow had built up so high that it was nearly impossible to navigate, but he had lived in the wilderness long enough to know how to find his way. His footsteps barely made an impression on the snow as the wind whipped around him, but Elias pressed on. He knew that if he didn't make it back to the cabin with the materials he needed, his chance at survival would diminish. The shed was 100 yards from the cabin, and each step felt like an eternity. By the time Elias reached it, his face was numb, and his hands were frozen despite the thick gloves. He forced the door open, letting the stinging wind rush inside. The small shed was stacked with piles of firewood and scraps of iron, most of it piled high in random heaps. There he found what he needed: more iron, a few extra pieces of wire, and some old tools that might just be useful for reinforcing the barrel. He carefully packed everything into his bag, and with a last look at the storm, he made his way back to the cabin. Every step was slow, the wind threatening to knock him off balance, but Elias managed to make it home, his heart beating faster with every passing moment. Inside the cabin, he began organizing the materials. There was work to do, and he had only the rest of the night to finish what he had started. The Ember barrel had to be perfected if it was going to stand up to the full brunt of the storm. Elias stood in the dimly lit cabin, his breath visible in the freezing air. The storm had not let up. If anything, it was worsening, the winds howling like wolves at the door. His fire, although a welcome comfort, could not compete with the biting cold. He had worked through the night, hammering away at the Ember barrel, using every bit of ingenuity he could muster. Now, in the light of a weak morning, he had a new goal: to see if the Ember barrel could really work. The cold inside the cabin had sunk into his bones, and he could feel the storm's bite no matter how many furs he wrapped around himself. Elias approached the barrel with a sense of both dread and hope. It had taken all his energy to put it together, but the design, flawed as it was, had shown promise in the small tests he'd run the night before. He crouched in front of the barrel, placing his hands carefully on the rough metal, its surface still warm from the coals inside. The fire had died down slightly through the night, but he could still see the faint glow of embers within. With a deep breath, he opened the vents and added more coal. The heat that radiated outward felt like a welcome embrace, but it was fleeting. Elias watched with intensity as the flames grew stronger. Slowly, the room began to warm up. He had adjusted the metal barrel, adding vents and reinforcing weak spots, but he knew that the true test wouldn't come until he tried it in full force. He added more coals, watching as they crackled and burned in the barrel. For a moment he thought it might work, that he had finally found the key to surviving the storm. The warmth started to spread, but Elias could tell that it wasn't enough. The cabin was still too cold. The wind outside seemed to mock him, howling louder, the temperature still dropping despite the effort. The Ember barrel was better than before, yes, but Elias could feel the cold creeping in through the walls and floors. He'd expected too much too soon. It wasn't just the barrel. It was the way the cold infiltrated the cabin, seeping in through every crack and gap in the logs. He needed more heat, something that could make the difference between life and death. Still, there was hope. The barrel's warmth was more consistent, more reliable than the sporadic heat of a fire. Elias knew he had made progress, but the full test would come that night, when the storm was at its worst, and he had no choice but to rely on his creation to keep him alive. Night fell quickly in the Rockies, the storm's fury intensifying as darkness swallowed the cabin. Elias sat on his bunk, staring into the flickering glow of the Ember barrel. The warmth from the coals was a welcome relief, but he knew the night would be long, the storm. Outside was an unrelenting beast, roaring against the small cabin, and Elias could already feel the cold starting to creep back into the room. He rose from his bedroll, the thick furs he had wrapped around himself offering little comfort against the deepening chill. The Ember barrel, which had shown so much promise during the day, was still burning bright, its warmth pulsing in the air. He felt a flicker of hope, but he also felt the nagging doubt at the back of his mind. Was it enough? Elias approached the barrel, crouching low to examine it closely. He had added more vents, adjusted the airflow, and reinforced the seams, but the cabin was still colder than it should have been. The winds howled relentlessly outside, and he knew that the storm wasn't letting up. His best chance for survival was this Ember barrel, and yet it was still imperfect. With a frustrated sigh, Elias fed more coals into the barrel, watching the flames leap higher, glowing a fiery orange. He felt the heat increase, but it wasn't enough to push back the relentless cold that had already taken root in the cabin. He moved around the room, adjusting the vents, checking for any leaks or areas where heat might escape. Each adjustment brought slight improvement, but the progress was slow. He had expected the barrel to work wonders, but now he realized that survival wasn't just about one invention. It was about continuous adaptation. The night dragged on, and Elias found himself drifting between small improvements and persistent failures. He worked tirelessly, adjusting the airflow, adding more wood, and even testing how the coals burned in different layers. The barrel could hold heat, but it wasn't enough to stave off the worst of the cold. The wind outside was relentless, and Elias knew he couldn't last much longer if he couldn't figure it out. At one point he sat down in frustration, staring into the flickering barrel. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, but he refused to give up. This wasn't just about surviving the storm, it was about surviving the next one, and the one after that. His mind raced as he thought about the possibilities. He couldn't stop now. Not after everything he had already invested into this invention. He would make it work. By morning, the storm had not abated, and Elias had managed to refine the barrel just a little more. The heat was more consistent, though still not perfect. It was enough, just enough, to survive the worst of the night. The Ember barrel wasn't the solution to all his problems, but it had come closer than anything else he had tried. It was a first step, a beginning. Elias woke to the muted sound of wind howling through the cracks in his cabin. The storm outside still raged with unrelenting ferocity, but inside, the Ember barrel had provided a semblance of warmth throughout the night. Elias rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of exhaustion on his body. The fire was low, but the room was still warmer than it had been the previous night. He could feel the dampness in his bones slowly lifting, but he knew he wasn't out of the woods yet. The Ember barrel had worked through the night, but barely. The temperature inside the cabin hadn't dropped to unbearable levels, but it hadn't been nearly as warm as he'd hoped either. As the first light of morning filtered through the small window, Elias sat on the edge of his bedroll, his mind racing. He could feel the strain of the storm still pressing down on him, and he knew he couldn't afford to waste another day with half measures. The barrel, for all its potential, was still not enough. Elias had been right to have hope, but it was clear now that his creation wasn't complete. He had to make it better. He had no choice. Survival wasn't about getting by. It was about overcoming. And to overcome, he needed to innovate once again. He stood up and stretched his stiff limbs, taking a long, careful look at the ember barrel. The glow from within still lingered, faint but present. He had seen small successes, and yet there was something nagging at him. A missing piece, an element that he had yet to unlock. What if it wasn't just about feeding more coal or adjusting the airflow? What if it was about a different approach entirely? The idea came to him slowly, as if the storm itself had whispered it into his mind. He grabbed a few tools, scrap metal, the hammer, and nails, and began his work. This time, he wasn't just reinforcing or adjusting. This time, he had to think differently. Elias realized that in order to truly harness the barrel's potential, he needed to encase it in something that would retain the heat longer, something that would act as an additional layer of insulation. It wasn't an easy decision. He knew his resources were scarce, but what he had wasn't enough. The tools were limited, and the materials even more so. But the storm wasn't waiting for him to figure it out. As Elias began to add a layer of thick canvas around the barrel, wrapping it tightly, he felt a flicker of hope. The canvas could act as a heat insulator. It could keep the heat from escaping as quickly, trapping it inside the barrel and, in turn, heating the air more efficiently. The work was exhausting, and Elias's hands trembled from fatigue. But as he finished, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The new layer was sturdy, well-fitted, and seemed to draw the warmth into the barrel rather than letting it dissipate into the air. He sat back on his bedroll, staring at the barrel, his heart racing with cautious optimism. For the first time in days, Elias believed that he had turned a corner. The storm still howled outside, but he had given himself a fighting chance. His creation wasn't perfect, but it was close. It had the potential to keep him alive through the worst of the winter. And for the first time, Elias believed that the ember barrel could become more than just a tool. It could become the lifeline he needed. The night that followed was as fierce as any Elias had ever faced. The storm had turned the Rockies into a frozen wasteland, the wind whipping snow into every crevice of his cabin. Elias, exhausted from the work of the day, sat in front of the ember barrel, his eyes fixed on the glowing coals within. The barrel, now wrapped in thick canvas, was his best hope for survival. He couldn't afford to be wrong. He had fed it with fresh coals, and the warmth it produced was palpable. But this time, Elias wasn't just waiting for the heat to rise. He was watching it carefully. The canvas seemed to be holding the warmth in, creating a consistent, manageable heat that spread evenly across the room. The fire in the hearth had long since died down, and yet the cabin felt more comfortable than it had in days. Elias lay back on his bedroll, feeling the subtle shift in the air as the warmth crept into the room. His bones, chilled from days of exposure to the storm, finally began to thaw. The faintest sense of relief washed over him. The ember barrel was doing its job, but it wasn't without its flaws. The canvas needed constant adjustments to ensure that it didn't smother the heat, and Elias found himself waking up at intervals to adjust the coals, stirring the embers to keep the warmth consistent. The night passed slowly, but the barrel held. As Elias lay awake, his mind wandering, he realized just how much of a difference it made. The heat was far more constant than it had been before. The room stayed warm long after the fire would have died out, and the cold, which had once gnawed at the edges of his cabin, was kept at bay. But he also knew that this wasn't the end. He still had to test it fully to see if it would hold through the next few days. As the morning light finally filtered through the small window, Elias found himself waking to a surprisingly warm cabin. The storm was still raging outside, but he had managed to sleep through most of it. His ember barrel had worked, truly worked, for the first time. It wasn't perfect, and Elias still had many adjustments to make, but he knew that it had passed its first true test. In the days that followed, Elias continued to refine his design. The canvas needed to be tightened in certain spots, and the metal had to be reshaped for better airflow, but the results were undeniable. The Ember barrel had not only kept him warm through one of the worst storms in his memory, it had given him hope. It had given him the belief that, with ingenuity, patience, and persistence, he could survive the wild. The storm, though still fierce, felt less threatening now. Elias knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. The Ember barrel had proven its worth, and with it, Elias had found a new way to face the dangers of the Rockies. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to rest, knowing he had turned the tide. Days passed, and Elias continued to refine his Ember barrel. The storm had finally relented, leaving behind a landscape blanketed in snow and ice. But the warmth from the barrel had remained constant, proving itself once again as the key to survival in the harsh wilderness of the Rockies. It wasn't just Elias who had noticed the difference. Soon the word spread among the nearby trapping community. One morning, as Elias worked on reinforcing the barrel's design with a few minor tweaks, a knock sounded at the door. He opened it to find a familiar face, a fellow trapper named Thomas, his fur-lined coat caked with snow. Behind him, another man stood, a stranger with an air of curiosity about him. "Elias?" Thomas called with a grin, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He shook off the snow from his shoulders and glanced at the Ember barrel in the corner of the room. "I've heard rumors about this contraption of yours." Elias stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "It works better than I thought," he replied, feeling a sense of pride wash over him. Thomas nodded, eyeing the barrel with something like cautious admiration. "Better than anything I've seen out here, that's for sure. And this is, what, a way to keep your cabin warm through the worst of it?" Elias gave a slow nod, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the two men standing before him. "Something like that," he said. "It works well enough if you know how to maintain it. Keeps the cold at bay, even through a storm." The stranger, Thomas's companion, stepped forward, looking at the barrel with interest. "How'd you come up with this idea?" he asked. Elias was quiet for a moment. It wasn't the first time someone had asked, but the question always brought with it a small pang of memory. Of John, of the loss that had driven him to create something that could protect against the wilderness. "Trial and error," Elias said simply, "and a lot of time spent figuring out what works." The stranger nodded thoughtfully, though Elias could tell he didn't fully understand. But Thomas, having spent many winters in the mountains, knew better. "That's the spirit," he said with a smile. "If it works as well as you say, we may just need to build a few of these ourselves." Elias didn't answer right away, instead staring at the barrel as it steadily emitted heat. He knew what the men were asking, what they expected. They wanted the secret, the method, the key to survival. And despite his reluctance to share, Elias knew he couldn't keep it to himself. Not anymore. The truth was, if others didn't adopt it, they'd be left at the mercy of the storm and the wilderness. "I'll show you," Elias said finally, his voice steady. "I'll show you how it works. It's not just the barrel, it's how you build everything around it." The days that followed saw more men coming to Elias's cabin. Some came out of genuine curiosity, others out of necessity. Word had spread quickly through the trapping community, and Elias had unknowingly become the center of attention. He spent hours explaining how he had crafted the Ember barrel, how he had adapted his cabin and the materials around him to retain heat, and the subtle methods he'd used to ensure its survival. Some of the men were skeptical at first, their faces lined with doubt. But when they saw the warmth, when they felt the comfort inside Elias's cabin, their doubts melted away. As the winter pressed on, more and more men sought his advice, eager to build their own Ember barrels. They would never have the same cabin, the same experience, but Elias had given them something they could rely on, the ability to survive the next storm. Elias didn't seek recognition. He wasn't looking for praise. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't help but feel that through the cold and through the loss, he had found something greater. He had found the means to protect not only himself, but the men who had once laughed at his methods. They would survive, not just by their own hands, but by learning to adapt, just as he had. Winter eventually gave way to spring, as it always did. The snow began to melt, revealing the tough, rocky ground beneath. The once unrelenting storm had passed, and the mountains, though still harsh, seemed a little more forgiving. For Elias, the change in the seasons marked a turning point, not just in the weather, but in his life. The Ember barrel had become more than just a tool for surviving the cold. It had become a symbol of resilience and innovation. As word spread through the community, more trappers began adopting his design. Some used his exact methods, while others modified them to fit their own needs. But the core of the idea remained unchanged. The Ember barrel had become a lifeline, one that kept men safe and warm against the worst of what the wilderness could throw at them. Elias didn't see himself as an inventor, not really. He was a survivor, just like the rest of them. But there was something deeply satisfying in knowing that what he had created had saved lives, that it had made the difference between life and death for men who had once dismissed his ideas as foolish. As the months passed, Elias found himself visiting other trappers' cabins, his Ember barrel becoming a fixture in every home he entered. He would share his designs, offer advice, and help where he could. And with each new cabin built, Elias knew that the legacy of his invention would live on long after the storm had passed. Years later, when Elias left the mountains to settle in Oregon, the Ember barrel was still in use in cabins across the Rockies. The trapping community had grown, and the men who came after Elias carried with them his knowledge, his methods. They had their own innovations, their own solutions to the wilderness's challenges, but the Ember barrel remained a cornerstone of survival. Elias would never claim fame for his invention. He didn't want recognition. His satisfaction came from knowing that his creation had allowed others to survive, to thrive in the harshest of conditions. As he stood on his ranch in Oregon, watching his children play in the fields, Elias smiled quietly to himself. The wilds of the Rockies would always be a part of him, but he had left behind something far more enduring than a cabin or a trapline. He had left a legacy of warmth, of survival, and of innovation. And in that warmth, the story of Elias Wilder would live on, not just in the cold winter winds, but in the hearts of those who had learned to survive because of him.